An Archaeologist. My name's Katie Fleming. I'm a staff member at the Phoebe A. Hearst Museum of Anthropology and the host of today's show. And I'm excited today to be speaking with my colleague at the Hearst Museum, Jordan Jacobs. Hi, Jordan.
Hi, great to see you, Katie.
Good to see you too. So Ask an Archaeologist is a series of live streamed interviews co-hosted by the Archaeological Research Facility and the Phoebe A. Hearst Museum of Anthropology, both located at the University of California at Berkeley. So during each program, we interview a UC Berkeley affiliated archaeologist and answer audience questions. So before we get started, I want to let you know how you can ask your questions today. So if you either look in the description of the video, you'll see a link to a website called Slido, or you can go on your phone or computer to sli.do/askarf, and you can just type in your question there. We'll be looking at those throughout the course of the show. And yeah, keep your questions coming. So I'm excited to introduce Jordan, who's worked at the Hearst Museum for 8 years now and serves as both the principal head of cultural policy and the acting head of archaeology and anthropology. He's also the author of the Samantha Sutton series, which we'll be talking about today, published by Sourcebooks Jabberwocky. And today he's going to chat with us a little bit about tombs, bats, adventure, and real science in his archaeological fiction for young readers. So thank you for being here, Jordan.
Thanks so much for having me. This is great.
So to get started, I thought maybe you could tell us a little bit about your work. How did you get into archaeology and museums and writing?
So I have loved archaeology and writing really since I was a very little kid. I remember being about 5 years old and going to my school librarian and requesting a book about mummies. And she thought it was very cute that I was asking, I guess, in maybe a British accent or something for a book about my mommy. But we cleared that up pretty quickly, and I really just dove into Egyptology. I mean, as a kindergartner, there was not so far I could go into that at all. But then I kind of skipped all the dinosaur phase and got really into visiting graveyards with my parents and into castles and just really getting excited about the past. And as I got older and I discovered the Indiana Jones movies, it just really became a passion of mine. So when I was in 8th grade, I actually got to go participate in my first real excavation, and it was totally not what I thought it was going to be. But I absolutely loved it. I loved that it was sort of like putting together a puzzle, and that it was like storytelling. And I really still believe that archaeologists are like storytellers. It's all about kind of piecing together little bits of the past to tell you stories of how people once lived. And so I think it works really well for writing and for fiction. And that's kind of what got me into writing the Samantha Sutton books, which was basically what I was thinking, what would I have liked to have read as a kid that would be a little more accurate than something like Indiana Jones, that would teach me actually about the science, but still incorporate kind of the fun and the mystery and the kind of intellectualism of putting together that puzzle.
Yeah, so full circle back to the library. This is the book that you wanted the librarian to say, here you go, when you asked about mummies and archaeology in the past.
Exactly. That's
cool.
Exactly right. Yeah.
So I think you're going to read a little bit to us from one of the books in the Samantha Sutton series. Is that right?
That's right. And there's not a lot of setup that's needed here. Basically, the series follows a young girl who, very much like I was when I was her age, she's 12, is very interested in the real science of archaeology. And as luck would have it, her uncle is a professional archaeologist, a little reckless, but not in his science, just kind of reckless in how he interacts with his niece and other people in his life. So they go together because he has a job that only she can do at the very real site of Chavin de Huántar in Peru, which I had the great honor of working in for about a summer back in college. So in this scene, Samantha has finally had time with her uncle alone at the site, and he is taking her to her assignment and why he has brought her there in the first place.
Very cool. So I'm going to show everyone a cover of the book that Jordan's going to be reading from today while we listen to Jordan read a little bit for us.
Great. Samantha and her uncle stood in a long, low corridor, one of the temple's galleries, which was bedecked on one wall with a string of bare electric bulbs. The wires were draped over a series of ancient stone pegs protruding from the wall at regular intervals. Jay flipped a switch and a weak yellow light sputtered forth. This one's sometimes open to tourists, he explained, almost apologetically. But the lights weren't enough to illuminate all of it. Shadowy chambers still yawned darkly along the left-hand side. Where are we, Uncle Jay? This, he announced with characteristic flair, is the Cautivos Gallery. Cautivos? Samantha asked, trying to come up with a similar sounding word in English. Captives, Sam. Prisoners, named by someone with an active imagination. He lifted his hands above his head, placed his wrists beside two of the pegs, and pretended to hang from them like a prisoner in a comic strip. Samantha smiled, and they moved farther down the hallway to a gap in the right-hand wall. It had once been a small doorway, big enough to allow a man of Jay's stature to squeeze through without much difficulty. But at some point in the last 2,000 years, one end of the massive stone lintel had fallen from its place above the door so that it now cut diagonally across the opening. Only a small triangle of space was left between the floor and the fallen stone, and it would be a tight fit, even for someone of Samantha's size. A wooden sign had been wedged into the opening, screaming, "Peligroso no pasar," in large white letters. But that's for the tourists, Jay explained, prying it free, not for us. What's down there? Jay beamed. That's what you're going to tell me. She stooped to peer through the opening, but the blackness of the inner gallery was impenetrable. The collapsed lintel seemed stable enough, and it looked like she would be able to push herself through, but still, the thought of a collapse or getting stuck inside was terrifying. You're sure it's safe? Her uncle's face grew serious. Well, Sam, I'll be honest. I can't say for sure. I think so, but it's really up to you. He must have sensed her uncertainty because he continued in a gentler tone. Let's think about the odds. For as long as anyone can remember, that stone has been there. It hasn't budged, not through earthquakes or landslides, or not from the hundreds of tourists who've tramped by it over all these years. The chances that you could dislodge it are small. But still, he added softly, the decision is yours to make. Samantha pounded the lintel with her fist. It felt completely solid. Okay, she said, I'll do it. The light showed a steep staircase leading down into the darkness, but what lay at its foot was blocked by a steeply sloped ceiling. She tightened her headlamp, pulling her braids through the straps at the back. Dropping to her stomach, she pushed her field notebook, tape measure, and trowel through the opening and heard them clatter down the stairs. She reached her hands in first, gripped the edge of the top step, and pulled, pushing with her feet at the same time. Soon her head was through, and then her shoulders, and then a grinding pain in her hips and a sickening panic in her stomach. She tried to squeeze back through the opening and into the dim electric light, but there was nothing to push against. She couldn't move. Uncle Jay? From somewhere above her, a pebble was dislodged, clattering against the stone walls and glancing off her shoulder. I'm stuck! She had a sudden, deep sense of dread, an insistent instinct to get out before the ancient ceiling collapsed and crushed her. She wanted to retreat into the safety of the gallery, but every movement was met with pain. Relax, Sam, I'm right here. Samantha arched her back, giving a final push with her hands, but nothing happened. I got you, her uncle reassured her. Brace yourself. But when Jay's hands wrapped around her ankles, lifting her feet into the air, it was to push her forward, not to pull her back into Cautivos. There was a tremendous pain in her back and hips and a rising horror inside her chest. But after a terrible moment, she was through, a crumpled ball in the dark. She was fine, if a little scraped, but already she dreaded her eventual exit. Take your time. Jane knelt to look through the opening. Oh, and Samantha? Yeah? I'll be right here. She was able to pull herself shakily to her feet and took her first steps downward. Almost immediately, the fumes hit her, a sharp chemical odor that seared her nostrils and brought tears to her eyes. She brought her arm to her face to wipe them away. She could do this, she thought, and used the beam of her headlamp to pick her way down the remaining stairs to the gallery floor. She gave a last look backwards, and through her watery vision saw her uncle's concerned face, framed by a halo of Cautivos electric lighting. The fumes grew stronger and her throat burned with each breath. The flashlight's beam seemed to quiver as it passed through the thick vapor and dissipated in what appeared to be a long, grand hallway at the foot of the stairs. Samantha turned the headlamp to the right, and a chamber seemed to open up, yawning darkly from the eastern wall. To her left, another chamber gaped gloomily, and shadows ahead of her showed that two more rooms came off the central corridor. She took a few hesitant steps forward, shining the headlamp along the passageway's walls. The massive stones seemed to bow outwards, straining under the weight of the centuries. The floor of the gallery was covered in a gritty gray substance, which in some places formed small hills that Samantha skirted around. These, it was quickly apparent, were the source of the smell, and while many sat like mounds of dry sand, others gleamed wetly in the light of the beam. She did her best to keep the goo off her hiking boots. When she came to the center of a long hallway, she stopped and opened her notebook. Her nose was running furiously now, and the smell of the strange substance penetrated everything. She found a dry spot to sit on the gallery's floor from where she could make her measurements, clearing the area as best she could with the edge of a boot. From her kneeling position, she pulled out the taut yellow ribbon of her tape measure until it clacked against the far wall. She scribbled the number in her notebook, repositioned herself, and did the same to measure the depth of the 3 side chambers. Okay, Uncle Jay, you're all set? Yeah, then come on back. It had taken her several minutes, and by now she'd almost gotten used to the odor, her runny nose hardening to form a protective plug. But as she stood, the smell broke through again with fury. And for the first time since she entered the gallery, Samantha looked up. At first glance, the ceiling seemed to be draped with a blanket of dry, dead leaves, curled and blackened like the last of an autumn's foliage. As she passed the beam of her headlamp among the papery husks, a shiver seemed to go through them, swaying as if stirred by the wind. And then, in a screaming mass of wings and fur, the ceiling seemed to collapse on top of her. Instinctively, she threw her hands up to cover her face, and immediately there was a warm and furious flapping along the length of her arms. Bats gripped at her hair and clothing. She swatted at them with her trowel, the beam of her lamp broken by hundreds of panicked rodents. The cloud grew thinner as they coursed in a churning mass for cautivos, blocking her exit and the light it provided. Coughing, she plunged through them towards the staircase, dodging the mounds of their stinking guano. She leapt up the steps 2 at a time. Through the tiny opening, Jay was waiting for her, covering his own face with his hands as the bats flew for the open air outside. Grab my hand, Sam, I'll pull you through. She dove for the opening through the roiling frenzy, her hands reaching frantically for her uncle's. Her head went through it easily, but to her horror, her shoulders caught, crushing a pair of bats against the collapsed doorframe. She twisted away from their bodies and was stuck again, hundreds of bats beating against her back and legs in their frantic struggle for an exit. Jay tightened her grip on her wrists and heaved. There was a terrible moment as she felt her body stretch and crack, but at last she was wrenched free and on her feet. And then she was being pushed by her uncle through the stinking swarm to the gallery's entrance. And then they were free, sucking in deep breaths of the clean Andean air as they threw themselves down on the temple's grassy roof. Samantha examined her arms and legs, noting with tremendous relief that they were scraped from the stones, but she was unbitten and otherwise unharmed. Murciélagos, Jay announced. What? Samantha asked, still breathless. That's a good name for it, don't you think? Galeria de los Murciélagos, the Gallery of the Bats? It makes sense to me, she wheezed. And as his niece sat shivering in her shock, Jay threw back his head and laughed until tears rolled infuriatingly from his eyes.
Thanks so much for reading that for us, Jordan.
Sure.
Before we ask you some questions from the audience and some questions that I have for you, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the photos that we were looking at in the background while you were reading and how they connect to that part of the story that you were telling.
Absolutely. So I think you saw a picture of the cover,
Mm-hmm.
and the cover features an actual feature of the site itself, deep in the temple itself, in the temple complex. There's a giant carved stone that in modern times has been called the lanzon. And it depicts this animal figure. It's very monstrous and very dramatic, and really, at least for much of the site's occupation, was probably kind of it marked the ceremonial center of the site, and is of great importance. Now, unfortunately, in publishing and in marketing of books, there is sort of a flair for the dramatic. There are no human remains like that around the Lanzon. There have been human remains found at the site, but not there, at least in recent times. So that is all sort of artistic license by the wonderful cover artist. But otherwise, the image of the Lanzon itself is pretty accurate. Then one of the other images you saw is just me like a million years ago in one of the galleries. And that is one that can be visited by tourists. You could see there are electric light bulbs up there, and you can enter these galleries. There are many, 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 I would say, I think the figure is many kilometers of galleries throughout the temple complex, some in pretty poor shape that you have to crawl through, although there's been a lot of great conservation efforts at the site, where there have been collapses over the years. There have been really amazing efforts to map all of the galleries and the whole complex. And I think that work is still ongoing.
And when you say galleries, you mean rooms and tunnels and different kinds of spaces that are inside of these structures.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah. So there's internal staircases. There's some of these seem specifically built to confuse and to bewilder. There are a lot of, and this is actually one of the reasons I chose Chavine to be sort of the perfect introduction to archaeology that still has sort of the power to mystify and bewilder us today. There are some evidence of some ancient practices at the site that were specifically meant to create the impression that some of the people who seem to run the temple in its heyday had supernatural powers of some kind. And so the galleries are just some of those. People could enter at one side of this enormous building and pop out the other side or in unexpected places. And so if you were a visitor in ancient times and we're seeing that, then you might very well be convinced that they had some sort of supernatural ability to do that. And then there are several other things that manipulations of light using mirrors, manipulations of sound, and given the acoustics of these galleries, that really created for a very mysterious and dramatic place in ancient times as well as today. And then the last image there, that's just the that's the newer part of the temple complex. It's the new temple. And it's in that structure where a lot of these galleries are, and where I had the great honor to work as a college student just for a one field season back in the year 2000, I believe. Yeah, 2000. So it's a great place, and it's difficult to visit, but I think much easier now than it was. I think the roads are much improved, and I would definitely recommend people go there. It has a fantastic new museum as well.
Very cool. So I'm just going to take us back for a minute to the cover again, because I want to transition into some questions here. And I want to thank Jordan for pointing out to us something that's so important when we're reading fictional series that are based on real science or based on historical things. This understanding that while what we're reading might be based in reality and telling us about real science, whenever we're looking at any kind of source, whether it be a historical source or a fictional source or an object, piecing apart what is the evidence that's telling us about where this information came from, and what are things that we need to understand are coming from a little bit of a different context. So Jordan pointed out to us that while some of these pictures on the cover here give us a picture of what we could imagine this book looking like, there are some things that are a little more creative too. And I also love that on the cover here, you pointed out when you were reading that Samantha crawls into this space by throwing her field journal, which I'm circling here, and her trowel, or her little small shovel that archaeologists use, through the passageway ahead of her. So I like that you can see those here and imagine that her carrying those around in the book. So I'm going to stop sharing the screen here. And we actually have some questions coming in from the audience as well, which I wanted to get into before we move on to some of my questions. So the first question we have is whether you had any relatives who worked in the field of archaeology before you.
I did not, but I have and had two very supportive parents who would entertain my requests as a small kid to be taken to archaeological sites or museums. I mean, they loved it too, so I don't think it was a great great pain for them. Um, and yeah, but nobody that I knew who were actually in the field. No.
Mhm. Cool. So my first question after hearing that great excerpt from the book is, how did you come to write these books, and what were some of the challenges in the process of incorporating that real science and the real stories into this fictional world that you created?
Sure. So I touched a little bit as we got going about kind of my overall motive for writing books like
Hmm.
this, but I do think that maybe I should provide a little more detail on some of the responsibility I felt in writing this. Um, while I was writing this, I was really hoping not to be sensational at all in how I was presenting kind of the archaeology there, and that's for a couple of reasons. One is because I really did want to convey the science as a science, because it is, and it has very specific methodology and codes of ethics. So in both the first book and well, in the entire series, um, there are consequences if archaeologists who are depicted act outside what is kind of ethically expected of them. Um, and a very related thing is that these take place where people actually live and work, but where they live. And these are sites that tell a story that forms a part of people's very identities, because there's a great old uh, saying that who what is it I was is a critical component of I am. I think I didn't get that exactly right, but it's true. I mean, these ancient sites and the stories that archaeologists tell are really impactful, and sometimes tread on in certain ways stories that people tell about themselves in their own past. And so I wanted to make sure that the books um, incorporated or at least acknowledged that some of the narratives that archaeology tells conflicts with the narratives that descendant communities and the people who actually live at these sites tell. And I try to explore that a little bit too. Um, so there are some places where I did take some artistic liberties, and just for the sake of the narrative, but I wanted to make it very clear to readers where I've done that. And so each book ends with an author's note where I actually describe, well, here I say this, but really it's more like this, or um, and things of that nature, just to kind of point readers in the right direction if they want to learn more about the site itself or the archaeology itself, rather than just kind of depend on my fictional version of it.
Cool. And I want to remind our viewers right now that if you have questions you want to ask, you can either click the link in the description of the video or type in sli.do/askr for ASKARF, and we'll be answering those questions. And we do have another one coming in now, which was from our audience. Why was it important to Samantha to choose a trowel that felt right? So remember, we were looking at that picture of the little shovel that Samantha has in her back pocket. And so this clearly is from a reader who's a little familiar.
Yeah. So, as Katie said earlier, that a trowel is one of the most important tools that archaeologists use. It's great for all kinds of things, but especially for very carefully removing soil in if you're digging it in a unit or around a specific feature. You can be very kind of nimble with it, so it's very great for like fine-tuned movements or larger movements. And I still have my trowel from Chavin. I haven't done a ton of field work since, because those things can get worn down pretty quickly and down to pretty small nubs. But it really is kind of the tool of the trade. And in the book, I have a little fun with it. there is another book series you may be familiar with about a young wizard and a school for wizards, where everyone, there's people get wands, and what their wand feels like and what it's made out of is a very important thing for them. And so I was having a little fun kind of making a parallel in the real world of archaeology.
Very cool. So a kind of bigger question that I have for you is, and you've touched on this a little bit about your motivation, why you wanted to write the book and what you hope people learn from the series about the differences between what they think about archaeology, or what they think archaeology might be, and what it really is and what it can mean. What would you say is one of the biggest takeaways you want readers to have from the series about archaeology as a field?
Well, first I'd start and say that my biggest takeaway that the biggest takeaway I hope people have is that it's just a fun adventure series. I think young readers are especially suspicious of and can tell when an author is trying to force feed them information. And it's sort of an eat your vegetables kind of book, and I really wanted to avoid that. So the lessons, I hope, are pretty integrated with the story and with the adventure. I think it's really important to first understand that archaeology is a science, and there's specific methodology that's involved and that's adhered to, and that there's consequences for not adhering to that, to those methods. And that one thing that I stress throughout the series is that Samantha's very careful of writing everything down. And that's because, and archaeologists know this and talk about this all the time, but archaeology is a destructive science. If you find something, how it's been left for hundreds or thousands of years, you are the only person to see it like that if you're an archaeologist. And so you really need to take very careful notes and in some cases photos of what it is that you're finding, because if you disturb it, then it's gone forever. And so and that kind of really relates to an overall sense of responsibility that I think that archaeologists feel. And that differs from, treasure hunting or, amateur collecting of archaeological material, which can even be legal in some places, in some circumstances. And I really kind of am trying to be an advocate for scientific collecting as well, because of the responsibility that archaeologists have.
Yeah. On that note, we have a kind of a similar question, or a related question, from one of our audience members. You're talking about how archaeology by its nature is destructive in the physical site, but productive in terms of allowing us to understand the past and learn and document. But of course, there's other kinds of destruction that happens to archaeological sites that's not for scientific purposes, and looting or people taking from archaeological sites, these other types of collecting or taking for different reasons have definitely happened in the past. So the question is, did the Spanish loot Chavin less than other sites? And is that why there's more there today than other places?
There is some evidence of some looting that happened in the colonial period, for sure. I don't know for certain if that what accounts for it being in relatively good shape, but I would guess that it's so remote and it's very difficult to get to even today, and must have been very difficult to get to, in the 16th and 17th century. So I'm sure that helped protect the site. But I do know there is evidence of pretty early contact with Spanish.
Can you describe for us, because I know you've told me before about the kind of remoteness of this site and what the experience of traveling to it is like? What does it look like when you get there, and how do you, so our listeners can imagine for a minute?
Sure. Well, I can quickly relate my experience, which was there were some political upheaval in Lima on the day that I arrived, and so we had to very quickly get up into the mountains into the site, and the elevation is so high over some of those passes that I passed out, and
Wow.
and yeah, and some of the other people I was with passed out as well. So when you arrive into this valley down these crazy switchbacks, it's just very, very dramatic, and it's just one of the most thrilling things I can remember from any travel I've been able to do.
And is the story that we heard about the bats, is that rooted in truth? Did you encounter a room in one of the galleries that was filled with bats?
Oh yes, I did. I did indeed. I didn't get stuck with them, but definitely was in some scenarios where they were flying around my face and getting caught in my hair and things like that.
Yeah. So some of the adventure parts of the story are definitely rooted in truth, and
Yeah,
that can give some readers a little fun perspective to think about when they're hearing these stories.
yeah,
Well,
exactly. Yeah.
yeah. So I just wanted to say thank you so much for speaking with us today and sharing an excerpt from the Samantha Sutton series, and see if you had any kind of last words for our listeners today.
I would only say that if anybody's interested in buying the books, they are available through kind of your standard online sellers of everything. But I really like to support independent bookstores. There's some great ones in Berkeley. Mrs. Dalloway's has been wonderful to me in the past. But also, if you want to order online, IndieBound will hook you up with sort of your local independent booksellers.
And for those who are more interested, we have some links to more information about the books in the description of this video. So feel free to take a look down there and click through to find out more. So thank you, Jordan, for being here. And thank you to our viewers. And I'll let everyone know that the next in the Ask an Archaeologist series is going to be next Tuesday, May 12th at noon. And I'll actually be interviewing another one of our Hearst Museum colleagues, staffer and archaeologist Paolo Pellegatti. So thank you, Jordan. Thank you, viewers. And hope everyone has a good rest of your day.
Thanks. Bye.